The thing about Margaret Chen was that she had never, in her entire life, failed at anything. This fact had become less a personality trait and more a religion, something she prayed to in the mornings while drinking her precisely measured 6-ounce espresso from the Italian machine that cost more than most people's cars. She had been the president of the HOA for 7 years running. 7, no one else even bothered to challenge her anymore. That wasn't arrogance, that was simply mathematics. Margaret had raised property values in the Riverside Estates subdivision by 23% through what she called assertive aesthetic governance, which was her polite way of describing the 15-page document she'd drafted outlining acceptable mailbox colors, lawn grass height, vehicle parking regulations, and most controversially, the specifications for front porch decor during each season. It was Tuesday morning when she first noticed the violation. The Henderson house, 1247 Oakmont Drive, 3 stories, built in 1998, currently valued at $847,000. She'd memorized every property record in the subdivision the way other women memorized recipes. The house was painted a tasteful beige with dark shutters, acceptable. The landscaping was maintained, acceptable. The driveway was sealed within the last 3 years, acceptable. But the mailbox... Margaret's hands trembled as she looked at her phone, zooming in on the photo she'd taken that morning. The mailbox was painted a deep forest green. Forest green, not the approved palette of blacks, grays, silvers, bronze, or white. And not just any forest green, it was artistic forest green with what appeared to be hand-painted birch trees wrapping around the sides. Her jaw clenched. She could feel it, that familiar tightening behind her right eye that preceded migraines of legendary proportions. The HOA bylaws were clear. Section 421, all external fixtures must adhere to the approved color palette to maintain neighborhood aesthetic cohesion. The Hendersons had received notice in March. They'd received a second notice in July. And now, in late September, they were staging what could only be described as a full-scale rebellion against the very fabric of civilized suburban life. Margaret typed an email with the speed and precision of a sniper. To Robert and Jennifer Henderson. Subject: Final Notice, Mailbox Violation, 1247 Oakmont Drive. CC HOA Board. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, this letter constitutes your final notice regarding the violation of HOA Regulation 421. Your mailbox remains in violation of approved color specifications. Per Section 8.3 of the bylaws, failure to remedy this violation within 14 days will result in 1. A fine of $500. 2. Daily penalties of $50 until remedied. 3. Potential legal action. We appreciate your attention to this matter. Respectfully, Margaret Chen, HOA President. She hit send at 6:47 a.m. before most people had finished their coffee. By 9:15 a.m., Jennifer Henderson had responded. Margaret, respectfully, you can take your final notice and use it for what it's best suited for. My 7-year-old daughter painted that mailbox during an art project. It makes her happy. We're not changing it. Jennifer Henderson. Margaret read the email 4 times. Each read made her vision sharper, clearer, more focused on a single point of utter injustice. A 7-year-old. That was emotional manipulation. That was a deliberate appeal to sentiment to excuse laziness and disrespect for community standards. She picked up her phone and called Jennifer directly. Jennifer, I received your email. Margaret, I'm not discussing this. The mailbox stays. Jennifer's voice was calm, which somehow made it worse. You're disrupting property values. Do you understand that? Every single home on this street is worth less because of that green box. Your own home equity is suffering. My daughter's happiness is worth more than your aesthetic requirements. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Then I suggest you reconsider what it means to be part of a community, Margaret said, and ended the call. She didn't think she'd ever been so angry, not when her ex-husband had left for his yoga instructor, not when she'd been passed over for VP at her law firm, not ever, because those things happen to everyone. They were abstract failures, but this was direct insubordination. This was someone looking her in the eye, metaphorically speaking, and saying no. The first drive-by happened that afternoon. Margaret told herself she was simply checking on other properties. Yes, she took a slightly different route home from the office. Yes, that route happened to pass 1247 Oakmont Drive. She slowed as she approached, her car naturally drifting into a lower speed as her eyes fixed on the mailbox. Forest Green, still there, still mocking her. She pressed the accelerator and continued down the street, her heart racing in a way that felt almost pleasurable. That feeling of adrenaline when something was profoundly wrong and only you could see it. By Friday, she'd driven past 7 times. By the following Wednesday, she'd lost count. Her colleague at the law firm, David, noticed first. She was in a meeting with him and 2 clients when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her entire body went rigid. It was an alert from the neighborhood app. Someone had posted a photo of Margaret's car, noting that it was the 3rd time they'd seen it drive past the Henderson house in 2 hours. The caption was simple: "Is everything okay?" Margaret, David was looking at her, so were the clients. "Yes, sorry, just property manager stuff, ongoing situation." But her hands were shaking as she put the phone away. She told herself it was about the bylaws, it was about upholding standards, it was about preventing the slow decay that happened when one person was allowed to break the rules. That was all it was. If she drove past the Henderson house, it was to assess the situation, to gather evidence, to understand the scope of the rebellion. It definitely wasn't about Jennifer Henderson's calm, confident voice saying no. It definitely wasn't about the fact that Margaret had never, in her entire life, been told no and had it stick. By the end of October, the Hendersons had received 3 more violation notices, each one with the fine increased, and the language slightly more formal, slightly more weaponized. Margaret had printed out every regulation, cross-referenced them with state HOA laws, and drafted a 17-page document detailing how the Henderson mailbox constituted an egregious breach of the community covenant. She drove past the house every day now, morning before work, evening on the way home, sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep. The mailbox remained forest green. Jennifer Henderson had stopped responding to emails. The HOA board, led by Margaret, had voted to escalate enforcement procedures. A lawyer's letter was drafted, citing Chapter 229 of the Florida statutes regarding homeowners associations and their enforcement powers. Margaret didn't think of herself as obsessed. She thought of herself as thorough. But at night, alone in her perfect, silent house, the one she decorated to magazine specifications, she drove past the green mailbox and felt something that might have been fury or might have been hunger. She couldn't quite tell the difference anymore. The thing Margaret didn't anticipate was that other people had histories too. Robert Henderson came to the HOA meeting on the first Tuesday of November. Margaret hadn't expected him. Jennifer usually handled the correspondence with a weary kind of resignation, but Robert actually appeared, sat down in the folding chair across from her at the conference table, where the Henderson matter had been scheduled as the first item on the agenda, ahead of the broken streetlight that had been out for 6 months, and smiled. It was a real smile, sad but real. "Before we get started," he said, "I want to show you something." Margaret opened her mouth to say that the meeting had specific parameters and protocols, but something about his manner stopped her. He was pulling out his phone, swiping, finding a photo. He turned the screen toward her. It was the mailbox, but beside it, a photograph of a girl, maybe 7 years old, with her arms around the mailbox like it was a beloved pet. Her face was radiant. Her smile was so open, so unguarded, that Margaret felt something twist in her chest. "That's our daughter, Lily," Robert said quietly. "She has selective mutism. Do you know what that is?" Margaret's jaw was tight. "That's unfortunate, but the bylaws." "It means she can't speak in certain situations. Anxiety just locks her throat. She's had it for 3 years. Therapy, medication, specialized school. We've done everything." He kept the phone up, the photo of his daughter still visible. "The art project started as occupational therapy. Her counselor said creating something, making something real that showed her identity might help her feel more present, more here." "That's very moving," Margaret said carefully, "but the neighborhood standards apply equally to all residents." "She painted that mailbox 6 times, Robert continued, as if Margaret hadn't spoken. "We repainted it 5 times. She kept repainting it the same color, the same design. And then one day she did something I hadn't seen in 2 years. He paused. Margaret waited. She spoke, not much, 1 word. "Please." Robert's voice cracked. "Please, can we keep it?" That was the first word she'd said to me in 2 years, Margaret. The first word her mother heard her voice, actually her voice, in 24 months. The conference room was very quiet. Margaret could hear the refrigerator humming in the break room next door. She could hear the sound of her own breathing. "So we kept it," Robert said, "and we're going to keep it." He stood up and left. He didn't wait for her response. He didn't wait to hear about fines or legal action. He simply stood, nodded slightly, and walked out, leaving the photo on the table. Margaret stared at it for a long time after he left. She told herself it didn't change anything. The bylaws existed for a reason. Community standards prevented chaos. If everyone got to decide which rules applied to them and which didn't, where would it end? It would end in anarchy, in disorder, in the kind of decay you couldn't stop once it started. That's what she told herself. But that night, she drove past the Henderson house and couldn't bring herself to slow down. The following morning, she called the law firm and told them she was taking the week off. The problem was that now she knew. Before, the Hendersons had been abstractions, violations, breaches, failures to comply. Now they had a story. Now there was a daughter who didn't speak, who had chosen that mailbox as her voice. Margaret sat in her home office, surrounded by neat stacks of HOA documents and enforcement letters, and felt something very close to doubt creeping in. She pushed it away. She opened her laptop and began researching selective mutism, the clinical definition, the psychological profile, the tragic stories of children unable to communicate despite desperately wanting to. She read about breakthroughs and setbacks. She read a study from Johns Hopkins about nonverbal creative expression as a therapeutic tool. At 11 p.m., she closed the laptop and poured herself a glass of wine. The problem with Margaret was that she had spent so long being right that she'd never learned how to be wrong. Wrong was something that happened to other people. Wrong was a failure of character, of discipline, of sufficient effort. She had driven past the Henderson house 42 times in the past 3 weeks, she'd counted. Of course she'd counted. 42 times for a mailbox, for a violation, for control. At midnight, she took another drive. The neighborhood was dark and quiet, the way suburbs got late at night, peaceful in a way that felt like someone had hit mute on the world. The Henderson house was dark except for a single porch light. The mailbox glowed pale green in her headlights. She pulled over across the street and just sat there. What was she doing? Who was she? When had she become this person? She sat for an hour, parked in front of someone else's house at midnight, and couldn't find an answer. By Thursday morning, she'd made a decision. She would withdraw the enforcement action. She would tell the HOA board that the situation was under review. No need for lawyers, no need for fines. She would step back and reevaluate. It felt like swallowing broken glass, but it was the right thing to do. She was drafting an email when her phone rang. It was David from the office. "Hey, I don't know if you've seen this," he said, his tone careful, "but there's something on the neighborhood app you should know about." Margaret pulled up the app with one trembling finger. It was a video, posted 47 minutes ago by a neighbor, Jessica Powell. The video showed Margaret's car, Margaret's silver Mercedes, parked in front of the Henderson house at approximately 12:30 a.m., exterior lights on, Margaret sitting motionless in the driver's seat. The caption read, "To whoever this belongs to, this is the 3rd time in a week we've spotted this car parked here in the middle of the night. Posting this for neighborhood safety. If this is you and you're okay, please let us know. If not, we may need to contact authorities." There were already 43 comments. The first 5 had identified her car. By the 23rd comment, someone had looked up her license plate online and posted her full name. By 38, they'd identified her as the HOA president who'd been harassing the Henderson family about a mailbox. The narrative had already written itself. Margaret set her phone down very carefully, as if it might explode if she moved too quickly. She thought about what came next, the explanations she'd have to give, the conversations with the HOA board, the way this would feel to Jennifer Henderson, being watched like that, having her home surveilled by the person who'd been threatening her. Margaret had done something without meaning to. She transformed from the enforcer of rules into the villain in someone else's story. And the worst part was, she couldn't quite remember when it had happened. The next morning, Margaret went to the Henderson house in person. She didn't call ahead. She didn't give them warning. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, gathering something that felt like courage but tasted like shame, before she finally got out and walked to the door. Jennifer answered. Her expression went through several transformations in rapid succession. Surprise, then wariness, then something that might have been pity. "I need to speak to you," Margaret said. "And Robert, please." They sat in the Henderson living room, which was warm and lived in, and full of the kind of comfortable disorder that Margaret's home would never tolerate. There were art supplies on the coffee table, drawings pinned to the walls, a child's sneakers by the door. It looked like a home where humans actually existed, rather than a museum display. "I saw the video," Margaret said quietly. "I know how it looked." "How it looked?" Jennifer's voice was sharp. "Margaret, you've been driving past our house for weeks. You parked outside in the middle of the night. That's not just. That's harassment. That's frightening." "I know." Margaret's hands were in her lap, her fingers interlaced so tightly she'd lost feeling. "And I'm sorry." Robert and Jennifer exchanged a glance. This was apparently not what they'd expected. "I've been thinking about this wrong," Margaret continued. "About all of it. Robert told me about Lily, about what that mailbox means, and I heard him, but I don't think I listened. I was so focused on the violation that I couldn't see the person." "That's very nice," Jennifer said, and she didn't sound very nice at all, but nice doesn't make midnight surveillance okay. "No, it doesn't, and I'm going to withdraw all enforcement action. I'm going to recommend to the board that we update the regulations to allow for individual expression regarding certain external fixtures. It was wrong to enforce it the way I did, and it was. Unhinged to." She paused. Even she didn't have a word for what she'd been doing. "I'm going to write a letter of apology to the neighborhood app. I'll explain that this was a personal situation that I mishandled." Robert looked at Margaret with something almost like sympathy. "What changed?" he asked. "Genuinely, what changed?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "I saw myself. For maybe the first time in a very long time, I actually looked at what I'd become and I didn't recognize her." There was a long silence. "My daughter's probably still asleep," Jennifer said finally, her voice a little softer. "We actually took her to see a musical yesterday. First time she's been in public in a crowd without a panic attack. She wore that painted mailbox on a t-shirt we had made. She felt brave." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. "I can't forgive you yet," Jennifer said. "That's going to take time, but I appreciate the apology, and I appreciate that you're going to stop." Margaret nodded. That was more than fair, more than she deserved. She was standing to leave when Robert said, "Actually, wait. Before you go, Jen, remember we were talking about that." "Oh God, yeah," Jennifer said. "Margaret, we found something, and we think you should know about it." "Found something?" Margaret's hand was still on the doorframe. "In our yard," Robert said. "You're a lawyer, right? Real estate law primarily, but we were going to put in a pool, got someone out here last week to assess the ground, do the soil tests, that kind of thing." Robert was walking toward the back of the house. "He found something underneath the yard, literally underneath, in the ground." They led her to the backyard through a sliding glass door. Margaret hadn't actually been on the Henderson property since the day she'd confirmed the mailbox color was definitely, egregiously forest green. The backyard was large and well-maintained, but there, near the center, was a section that had been marked off with tape and stakes. Beside it, a young man in a polo shirt with "Superior Soil Testing" stitched on the pocket was carefully working with ground-penetrating radar equipment. "We're finding structural anomalies," the soil tech said, not looking up from his screen. "Gonna need to bring in an archaeologist or a historian, probably. This is outside my wheelhouse." "Structural anomalies?" Margaret moved closer. "What do you mean?" "There's a void space maybe 3 feet down," the tech said, pointing at the radar image on his screen. "Large one, and there's stonework. Can't tell from the GPR alone, but it's definitely not modern construction. Could be a historic foundation, could be a basement, could be something else entirely." Margaret felt her heart rate accelerate. "Have you contacted anyone?" "We called the County Historical Society," Robert said. "They're sending someone out this afternoon. We thought you, being an attorney, might want to know because this affects property value, right? And if this neighborhood has historical significance, that could change things. It could make the regulations actually more important, not less." Margaret stared at the marked-off section of yard. "Beneath the earth, stonework historic." "What year was your house built?" she asked. 1998, Jennifer said. But the property records go back to the 1890s. There was another house here before ours, apparently. Some kind of estate that burned down in 1956. An estate that burned down. Margaret's legal mind was already spinning through possibilities. If there was a historic structure underneath, even a foundation or remains of one, that would trigger all kinds of preservation laws. County ordinances, maybe even state regulations. The property could be protected, which meant no pool, no major renovations, possibly restrictions on exterior changes to maintain historical authenticity. The green mailbox was suddenly the least controversial thing on the Henderson property. "You should have a lawyer before anyone official gets here," Margaret said, her professional instincts kicking in despite everything else. "Do you have one?" "Not yet," Robert said. "I'll help," Margaret said, and heard herself saying it before she'd quite decided. "Free of charge. I think I owe you that much and more." By late afternoon, the County Historical Society had confirmed the suspected presence of a buried structure. The Henderson property was now officially flagged as a potential historic site pending further investigation. Margaret stood in her car in the Henderson driveway, watching the county officials photograph and document what they could see from the surface. The green mailbox, meanwhile, seemed to glow with a different kind of significance now. It wasn't a violation. It was a flag. A signal that this house, this family was here, was real, mattered. By evening, the neighborhood app had entirely shifted its narrative. The video of Margaret's car had been deleted. In its place were excited posts about a potential archaeological discovery. One user had already looked up the property records and found the original estate deed from 1889, speculating wildly about what might be underground. Margaret wasn't the villain anymore, because no one was paying attention to Margaret anymore. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt oddly untethered, like she'd been ejected from a role before the play had ended. The archaeologist arrived on a Saturday morning with 2 graduate students and a van full of equipment. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo was a woman in her mid-60s with the kind of focused intensity that reminded Margaret of herself, except directed toward things that actually mattered. She moved carefully through the marked-off yard, kneeling to examine the earth, running her fingers across exposed stone as if it could tell her secrets. "This is definitely intentional construction," she said within the first hour. "Not a foundation. These are worked stones. Look at the tooling marks. This is careful work." The soil test had revealed the rough outline. A rectangular structure approximately 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, buried roughly 3 feet down. The walls appeared to be made of fitted stone blocks, which was already unusual for a structure from the 1890s. Most foundations from that era in this region were either concrete or stacked stone with mortar. These were fitted precisely, almost professionally. "You're looking at something older than the estate," Dr. Okonkwo said. She looked at Margaret, who'd positioned herself as the unofficial legal advisor to the Hendersons. "Any records about what was here before 1889? Margaret had actually spent the morning in the county clerk's office, digging through property records with the same obsessive detail she'd previously applied to HOA violations. Before 1889, the land had been held by the Daytona Land Company, a development firm that had existed from 1881 to 1892 before dissolving under mysterious circumstances, according to a note in one historical summary. Before that, the records got fuzzy. Spanish land grants from the 1820s, potential Seminole territory before that, nothing concrete. "I'm not sure," Margaret said, "but if you think this date's older than the 1890s, there might be archives that." "I don't think," Dr. Okonkwo said. "I know, look at the stone type and the tooling method. This is mid-19th century work at the latest, possibly earlier. Could be 1850s, could be 1780s. We won't know until we excavate." By the following week, the excavation had begun in earnest. Margaret found herself at the Henderson house most days. Ostensibly, she was there as legal advisor. In reality, she'd become fascinated by what was literally being unearthed beneath suburban normalcy. The Hendersons seemed to find this amusing. "You know, you could go back to your regular life," Jennifer said one afternoon, watching Margaret photograph the excavation for documentation purposes, legal purposes, she told herself. "You don't have to be here." "I want to be," Margaret said, and it was true. This was the most present she'd felt in years. This was something real, something that mattered beyond bylaws and property values. By day 10 of the excavation, Dr. Okonkwo had uncovered the roof. It was stone fitted together in an arch, and beneath it lay darkness, an actual void space that yawned beneath the surface like a held breath. "It's sealed," one of the graduate students, a young man named Marcus, said, carefully photographing the stone overhang. "Deliberately sealed, see these marks? And the fitted stones at the entrance, it's not just architectural, it's protective. Someone sealed this deliberately." Dr. Okonkwo was already on her radio, calling for reinforcements. This had become bigger than a site excavation. This was an archaeological find of potentially significant historical value. It took 3 days to carefully excavate around the entrance without disturbing the internal structure. By the time they could actually open it, there were 5 professionals on site, including a conservator, another archaeologist specializing in structural preservation, and a representative from the Florida Department of State, Division of Historic Resources. Margaret stood at the perimeter with Robert and Jennifer, who'd been granted permission to watch the process in their own yard. Lily was at school, blissfully unaware that her artistic mailbox project had led to the discovery of what appeared to be an underground tomb or vault. "This is incredible," the structural archaeologist said. Her name was Dr. Reeves, running her hands carefully over the stone archway. "The preservation is remarkable. This would have been sealed approximately, I'd estimate 130 to 160 years ago. The lack of moisture intrusion suggests whoever sealed it did a very thorough job." "A crypt?" Robert asked. "You're saying there's a crypt under our house?" The term crypt typically refers to burial chambers, usually associated with religious structures, Dr. Reeves said carefully. "Though crypts can exist independently, we won't know what this is until we open it properly." The process of opening it took hours. They worked with archaeological precision, documenting every angle, every detail before anything was disturbed. Margaret watched and found herself holding her breath, as if she and everyone present were trespassers at the moment of some ancient awakening. When they finally widened the entrance enough to shine lights inside, what they found was immediately and undeniably wrong. Not bones, not reliquaries or religious artifacts, or the expected contents of a 19th century burial structure. Books, hundreds of them stacked carefully on shelves carved directly into the stone walls. Books, preserved in the dry darkness, their leather bindings still intact, their pages seemingly untouched by time. And among the books, stacks of letters tied with ribbon, journals, what appeared to be historical documents, some rolled and sealed with wax. Dr. Okonkwo made a small sound, not quite a gasp, something more like the breath of someone witnessing something they'd only read about in academic theory. "Don't touch anything," she commanded, though everyone had already frozen in place. "No one touches anything until we've documented and photographed everything, and until the conservator has assessed the environment. This is," she paused, her voice filled with something between awe and reverence, "this is remarkable." Margaret felt Robert's hand find hers. She looked at him, this man whose daughter's art project had led to all of this, and saw her own shock reflected back at her. "What is it?" Jennifer whispered. "I think," Dr. Okonkwo said slowly, never taking her eyes off the sealed chamber, "someone was preserving history. Someone was very deliberately hiding and protecting something they thought was important enough to seal away underground." Over the next 3 weeks, the contents of the crypt were carefully removed, documented, and analyzed. What emerged was a historical discovery of regional significance. The books were primarily philosophical and political texts from the early to mid-1800s, some of them quite rare and valuable. The journals and letters, when carefully transcribed, told the story of a network of educated free black people operating during slavery, creating a hidden library of intellectual and historical records that they couldn't risk keeping openly. The sealed crypt, apparently constructed under what had once been a private home, was a time capsule of resistance and intellectual preservation. The last journal entry, dated November 1863, explained that they were sealing the library because the owner of the property was being conscripted into the Civil War, and they couldn't risk discovery. The library had remained sealed for 161 years. "This is going to rewrite local history," Dr. Okonkwo told Margaret, Robert, and Jennifer in a formal meeting at her university office. This represents a crucial document of pre-Civil War intellectual resistance. These texts, these letters, they're going to be invaluable for historians studying the agency and intellectual life of free black communities during this period. "So what happens now?" Margaret asked, in the tone of someone who'd become accustomed to asking official questions. "Now, a full inventory and assessment. Conservation work. These books need professional restoration. Museum consultation. Eventually, I'd expect the Smithsonian will be interested in housing at least some of these materials, though your local historical society will likely want copies and potentially some original pieces for the community." "And the property?" Jennifer asked carefully. "Our house?" "It's definitely going on the historic register," Dr. Okonkwo said. "You're now living on a site of significant regional historical importance, which means—" She paused. "Well, it means significant restrictions on alterations and development. No pool, no major renovations without approval from the Historic Preservation Board. But it also means tax incentives for preservation, and the property value will likely increase due to historical significance." Jennifer looked at Robert. Robert looked at Jennifer. They both looked like they were trying to process the fact that their property tax situation had just become exponentially more complicated. Margaret was doing the math in her head. She was, after all, still very good with regulations and restrictions. "You're saying the restrictions will supersede the HOA bylaws," she said quietly. "Probably," Dr. Okonkwo said. "Historic preservation falls under state regulation. It overrides local ordinances in most cases." So the green mailbox, which had been the impetus for everything, would now exist in a legal framework far larger and more powerful than anything Margaret could have enforced. It would remain exactly as Lily had painted it, protected not by Margaret's relenting conscience, but by 161 years of preserved history and the weight of state law. The HOA meeting where Margaret announced her withdrawal from the presidency was the most poorly attended in 7 years. Word of the historical discovery had spread through Riverside estates like electricity through water. Everyone was talking about the crypt, the books, the hidden library. In that context, the green mailbox suddenly seemed not like a violation, but like a gateway to something larger and more meaningful than neighborhood aesthetics. Of the 11-member board, only 7 showed up. "I'm announcing my resignation as HOA president, effective immediately," Margaret said without preamble. "I'm also requesting that the board rescind all enforcement actions against the Henderson property and that we begin a review process for updating our bylaws to be more responsive to community needs and less absolute in their enforcement." "Margaret, this is sudden," Paul Michaels, the treasurer, said carefully. "Is everything okay?" "Is everything okay?" No, everything was not okay. Margaret had spent the last month coming to terms with who she'd been and who she might become if she wasn't careful. She'd spent nights unable to sleep, replaying her behavior, the 42 drive-bys, the midnight surveillance, the escalating legal threats over a mailbox. She'd been, by any objective standard, unwell, and she'd used the authority of her position to make everyone around her confirm her wellness through compliance. "No," Margaret said, with the clarity that comes from finally being honest. "Everything is not okay. I have not been okay for a long time, and I was using the HOA to manage something that needed actual help, not regulatory enforcement." The room went quiet. "I have been meeting with a therapist for the past month," she continued, "and I'm strongly recommending that the board consider bringing in an external mediator to help us establish healthier governance practices. We have authority for a reason, but authority without humility is just control, and I was controlling." She handed her resignation letter to the secretary and stood up. "The Henderson family has volunteered to host a neighborhood historical society meeting where Dr. Okonkwo will present the findings from the crypt excavation. I think seeing what comes from approaching this community with curiosity instead of judgment might be valuable for all of us." Margaret gathered her documents and left before anyone could ask further questions. She drove to the Henderson house instead of going home. She hadn't called ahead. She just parked in their driveway and knocked on the door. Jennifer answered, and her expression shifted from surprise to something more guarded. "Can I talk to Lily?" Margaret asked. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Jennifer said carefully. "I know, but I'd like to ask her myself." Lily was at the kitchen table, doing homework. and she looked at Margaret with the particular wariness of a child who'd learned not to trust adults making grand gestures. "Hi, Lily," Margaret said quietly. "Can I sit down?" Lily nodded slowly. Margaret sat across from her. "I owe you an apology. Your mailbox, what you painted on it was beautiful. And I told your mom it couldn't stay, and I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with your mailbox and everything to do with something broken in me. I'm sorry." Lily looked at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet Margaret almost missed it, she said, "My mailbox." She said it not like a question. She said it like a statement of fact, like she was claiming it, nomming it, making it real. "Yes," Margaret said. "Your mailbox, it's beautiful and it's yours, and I'm sorry I didn't see that before." Lily considered this, then went back to her homework. Jennifer walked Margaret to the door. I don't know what that was," she said. "An attempt to do something right," Margaret said. "I know I haven't done that yet, but I'm trying." Lily wrote that word, the first word she said in 2 years. "Please," she wrote it in her art journal after you left the other day, Jennifer said. She drew that green mailbox and wrote "please" under it over and over. It's like it became more real because you acknowledged what it meant. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad something good came from my being here." "The crypt came from you being here," Jennifer said. "Without your obsession with our mailbox, we never would have called the soil tester. The soil tester never would have found the void, and 161 years of history would have stayed underground." "That's not because I was good," Margaret said. "That's despite me being terrible." "Sometimes those things are the same," Jennifer said. 1 year later, Margaret stood in the Henderson driveway with a camera around her neck. Not her phone, an actual camera, taking photographs of the historical marker that had been installed that morning. The County Historical Society had officially designated the property as the Riverside Hidden Archives site, recognizing it as a location of historical significance. The marker was bronze, recently polished, and it sat at the corner of the property, visible from the street, impossible to miss. Below the title, it read, "Beneath this site lies a sealed repository of intellectual and cultural records preserved by free black citizens during the 19th century, sealed 1863, discovered 2024. Their commitment to preserving knowledge and history across centuries is a testament to the power of collective memory and resistance." "It looks good," Lily said. She was standing beside the mailbox, which remained forest green and had been photographed by the State Historical Society as part of the property documentation. She'd actually become something of a local celebrity among art classes, the girl whose artistic expression had led to a historical discovery. She wasn't speaking much more than she had been, but the words she did speak seemed more present, more intentional. "It does," Margaret agreed, lowering her camera. "Your mom's inside." "Helping with the plates," Lily said. "They're having people over." "That's nice," Margaret said. A neighborhood gathering to celebrate the historical marker installation. Margaret had been invited, but she'd almost declined. A year of therapy had taught her about appropriate boundaries, about recognizing when her presence might be unwanted or harmful. But Jennifer had insisted. "You're part of this story now," she'd said on the phone. "The weird beginning led to everything else. That's part of the history." Inside, the Henderson house was full of people. The entire historical society, Dr. Okonkwo and her graduate students. Several board members from museums who were working on the cataloging and preservation of the books from the crypt. Other neighbors from Riverside Estates, many of whom Margaret had sent violation notices to over the years. And Robert, standing in the kitchen with a plate of food, catching Margaret's eye and nodding, not a gesture of forgiveness exactly, but of acknowledgement. Coexistence. Paul Michaels, the HOA treasurer, caught her by the punch bowl. "You should have run for president again," he said. "We could have used you. The new president is less interested in enforcement." "I know," Margaret said. "That's why I didn't run." She spent the afternoon taking photographs and talking to historians about the books and letters still being preserved and digitized. By evening, most of the guests had left, and she found herself in the backyard where the excavation had happened, now covered over but marked with a garden that Lily had planted on top of the sealed site. "It's beautiful," she said to Robert, who'd come out with a beer and seemed to want the quiet of the yard. "We couldn't pave over it," he said. "Seemed wrong, plus Lily likes the idea of growing something on top of history." "Deep," Margaret said. Kids usually are, Robert agreed, when they're given space to be. Margaret wasn't sure if that was a gentle reference to her behavior or just an observation. Probably both. "I'm sorry," she said, because it felt like these words needed to be said again in this place where the crypt had been found. For all of it. For the drive-bys, the legal threats, the surveillance, for making your family's life harder. Robert was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden where truth had been hidden and then brought to light. "You know what I think," he said finally. "I think you were drowning, not an excuse for what you did, but an explanation. And I think seeing our family, seeing Lily, seeing something that didn't fit your system, I think that cracked you open in a way that needed to happen. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt, but it meant something." "That's generous," Margaret said. "No," Robert said. "It's just honest. You were broken. You used the HOA to manage it. But underneath the broken thing was just a person who'd lost the ability to see other people. And now you can see them again. That matters." Margaret looked at the garden, at the mailbox beyond it, at the historical marker glowing slightly in the approaching evening light. "I'm starting a new practice," she said quietly. "Pro bono work, helping residents navigate HOA disputes, but from their perspective, helping them understand their rights instead of enforcing regulations." "That's good," Robert said. "I'm also attending an 8-week mindfulness retreat," Margaret continued. "Silence, meditation, the whole thing. I think I need to learn how to exist without thinking so much." "That sounds hard," Robert said. "I think everything worth doing is," Margaret replied. They stood together as the evening deepened into purple, and Margaret thought about the crypt, about 161 years of preserved knowledge hidden in darkness, waiting to be found. About a little girl's green mailbox that had opened a door to history. About the strange alchemy of obsession that could become curiosity, of control that could become connection. She'd been wrong about so many things. But maybe, she thought, watching Lily through the window as she drew something at the kitchen table, maybe the point wasn't being right. Maybe the point was being willing to be wrong. 6 months after the historical marker installation, a new discovery emerged from the archived materials that the historians were still analyzing. Dr. Okonkwo called Margaret directly, her voice tight with the kind of excitement that usually meant something significant. "We found a letter," she said without preamble. "From 1862. It's a personal letter written by one of the library's founders, a man named Thomas Reeves, no relation to the structural archaeologist, as far as we know. In the letter, he's describing his concerns that the property might be searched or confiscated, and he references the people who would need to protect what they'd built." "Okay," Margaret said, unsure why this required an immediate phone call. "And that's significant because one of the names he lists as a trusted steward of the site is a woman named Margaret Chen. He describes her as a woman of principle who understands that boundaries exist to protect what matters." Margaret actually sat down at the words. That's a coincidence. That's a common name." "The letter goes on to talk about her," Dr. Okonkwo said. "Her beliefs about order, about systems, about the importance of rules. He acknowledges that she might be misused by those in power, but that ultimately a person with her nature could be a guardian if given the right understanding of what she's guarding." "I don't understand," Margaret said, though part of her absolutely did, "in the way you understand impossible things." "It's metaphorical," Dr. Okonkwo said. "Or possibly prescient, depending on your beliefs. But Margaret, we've been analyzing the handwriting, the paper, everything about this letter. It's genuine. It's from 1862. And it seems like your name, or your soul, or whatever you want to call what's happening here, has been waiting in that crypt for you to find it." After she hung up with Dr. Okonkwo, Margaret sat very still in her home office. The walls were the same walls they'd always been. The desk was the same desk. But something in her had shifted, the way reality shifts when you realize it's more complicated and more meaningful than you'd ever understood. She called Robert. "Did you know?" she asked when he picked up. "Did you know about the letter? Did you know that name?" "Margaret, I didn't know anything about this," Robert said, though he didn't sound surprised. "What happened?" She told him. She heard him put his hand over the phone, heard him talking to Jennifer in muffled tones, then he was back. "Jennifer wants to know if you'll come over," he said. "She has something she wants to show you." The Henderson house was becoming familiar to Margaret now. She'd been back many times over the past 6 months, sometimes for family events, sometimes to help with legal matters related to the historical site, sometimes just because they'd invited her, and she'd come to value these people in a way that surprised her. Jennifer met her at the door with Lily. The girl was holding a journal, leather-bound and old, with a bookmark ribbon hanging from it. "This was in the back of one of the boxes from the crypt," Jennifer said. "The Historical Society made copies of everything before the originals went to preservation, and they gave us copies of the materials specific to our property. We haven't looked through most of them yet, but Lily found this one." The journal was labeled in careful script. "The Book of Futures, Margaret Chen, Keeper of Boundaries, 1862 ongoing." Margaret's hands were shaking as she took it. "Open it," Lily said, her quiet voice carrying the weight of someone who rarely speaks but means what they say. Margaret opened to the first page, where a handwritten entry in elegant script read, "To the Margaret who comes after, in whatever time and form you find us. We have preserved these words, these ideas, these truths in darkness because we knew that light might find them. We hid them because we understood that power abhors what threatens its assumptions. You will be born into a world that will teach you that order is control, that systems are protection, that boundaries exist to exclude rather than to preserve. You will be good at this. You will be very good at this, and for a time you will believe it. But I am writing to you across time to tell you. There is a day coming when you will stand in a backyard beneath a suburban street, and you will look at something that doesn't fit your system, and you will have to choose. Will you defend the system, or will you defend the people? The choice you make will determine whether boundaries become walls or gateways. I am betting on you, Margaret. I am betting that the part of you that loves order and precision is actually a gift, if you learn to use it to protect what deserves protecting, rather than to crush what doesn't fit. The Henderson family will teach you this if you let them, and you will become what you were always meant to be, a guardian of what matters. In the darkness beneath their house, we have left our greatest work, and we have left it for you to find. Not to control, not to regulate, but to understand, to witness, and to protect. Yours across time,